Yes.
So you told a story of this sort of upwelling of religious experience and this new age starting circa 2000. But there also seems to be another phenomenon going on, which is some sort of cultural immune system kind of response to that. I wonder if you have anything to say about how that fits into what makes pattern interesting here.
Yes, the social response. Well, there are a number of reasons that the idea is frightening. Psychologically, we generally like to feel our own ego, our own self is strong. Okay, and yet if this requires putting the self to the side, that is psychologically frightening. A transpersonal experience can be frightening. Also, we have, since Richard Nixon, the war on drugs, and then all drugs are bad. Also, this undercuts the authority of a lot of churches and a lot of individual people who base their religion on text. Because if you say there's something more fundamental than text, which is religious experience, then you use the experience to interpret the text rather than the text to interpret the experience. And there's a lot of theological arguing about that. Also, I think there are a lot of people for whom psychedelics are not a good path. They might be eventually, but this puts me in a bind because I like to think that if a religion is good for people, it ought to be good for everybody or most people. On the same time, I don't think this practice is good for most people. Does that sort of get it? And I mean, we have, and also, well, in the last 500 years of Western history, we have a great distrust of other mind-body states, that is, states of consciousness. I prefer mind-body to state of consciousness. And one of the reasons for this is that to read and understand a text, it's usually best to be in an ordinary awake state. Now, I know people who have been tripping and read the Bible and really thought they understood it for the first time. Okay, so now, do we want to do this in religion classes or in seminaries or theological schools? I think this should be done, at least for the reason that it's important to consider every possible meaning for an important text. The more important the text is, the more you should be able to examine it. If it's unimportant, it doesn't make any difference. Okay. But that's the way I'm looking at that. And you had a question, right? Did you have one? Oh, do you want to?
You know what? I'm going to hand the mic to everybody who's asking a question
okay.
so that everybody can hear. Good.
Thanks. You asked a question or posed one in the middle that you did not go back to, which you, I think, said was one of the most important questions, and that is, what's the reality of what's happening? In other words, I've had experience on drugs and had people say, well, you're just on drugs. Or it's just a sort of mind shift that's a set of neurotransmitters and neurochemicals, and it's not real. Now, I have my own answer to that question, but I'm really curious about yours.
Okay, mine is that the question, the topic really deserves a lot of attention, and it raises really interesting questions. For example, in philosophy and sometimes in psychology, there are things called qualia, like C-sharp, red, sweet. They're the senses, basically, okay? And from that perspective, basically everything we take in has to do with these combinations of qualia, when voice, smell, sound, and so forth. Now, what I'm wondering is if somebody can take a psychoactive drug and have a sense of sacredness, significance, and meaningfulness, does this mean that there are qualia which are generated in our brains or in our nervous systems? Because people have that sense. Normally, we attribute it to some figure, word, something that's out there. We say something is sacred, meaningful, or significant, meaning it has to do with our ordinary awake state and it's meaningful to us in that state. But if we can have those experiences, those sacredness, spirituality, and meaningfulness, and are they generated internally to us, like a dream? Okay. Now, most of us don't think that if we have a dream that that's something that's happening, quote, in reality out there. Is it possible to generate sacredness in the same sense that we generate dreams, only to do it with an entheogen rather than whatever other way it's done? And now, if so, if Sacredness is a quality that I generate interior to me. Okay. Now, in almost all my life, everything I experience comes through my senses, right? And I think that the experiences I have to do with things out there. So if I have an experience of sacredness, do I make the jump that it's because of things out there that are causing the sacredness? Or, see, it's just like interpreting or misinterpreting a dream. Do we interpret or misinterpret sacredness? If I feel a sense of sacredness, do I project it off on whatever happens to be there? Maybe it'll be a church, maybe it'll be a tree, maybe it'll be my thumbnail. Okay? And one of the experiences in psychedelics often is, oh, I realize everything is sacred. Now I see the whole world is sacred. And I hadn't seen that before. So just as, there's infrared and ultraviolet, and we can imagine we might be able to stretch our visual system to be able to see those. Can we stretch our conceptual system to perceive sacredness? So do I take that sense of sacredness and project it out on the world and say, yes, the whole cosmos is sacred? I know because I experience. I would misinterpret the sacredness by thinking it's the outside world that's impinging the sacredness on me when I'm generating it inside and projecting it off on the world. Now the question is, how do you interpret this? Okay, if someone has a mystical experience, there are three big interpretations of this. One is obvious: the person is taking a drug, the drug gives them a certain effect. That's the argument that you're talking about. So we know it isn't quote real. Okay, and you can do things to your brain. Okay, you can put little electrodes in your brain, and you can feel hungry, you can feel horny, you can feel hurt. But we wouldn't say that therefore you are hungry, you are horny, you are hurt. Okay, and so this may be a chemical way of doing this. So some people would say, well, this just proves sacredness and sacred experiences are just some weird thing going on in the brain. You don't have to imagine some great guy up there or, all these spirits around. It's just a chemical thing. It's like a dream. Or you can say, I see now. I'm tuned into sacredness. I didn't see this before, like seeing infrared, and realizing, yes, the world is a sacred place. I see what the texts and the clergy are talking about when they say we live in a world of sacred space. And do that. Now here's one to have fun with creationists. Okay, if you start with the assumption that God created the human brain, which is sort of one of the basic sort of creationist arguments, and our brain has mystical experiences on drugs, why did God design our brain to have mystical experiences on drugs? Okay. What do you do with that answer? See? And now what you get is you get people confirming their own assumptions. It's like so many arguments. So I mean that's kind of what you're getting, what that person's question is asking you is underneath is these are my assumptions about what's real and what's isn't real, and yours it's just a drug effect. But it seems to me there are unreal things about drugs. When I've taken LSD and seen the walls move, I don't think they really moved. I think it's a perceptual thing going on in there. Okay, and if that's true, then how do we separate the perceptual things going on in there from actually seeing things? Another common experience is the enrichment of music and art and color and texture and those. So those seem, in a sense, to be real. Or is it just a matter of amplifying, sort of turning up the volume of the parts of my brain, the circuits of my brain that do that stuff? And to make it even worse, the answer may be some combination of these. Okay? And if anybody can solve that, boy, I would really like to know. Yeah.
I'd like to suggest to you that there's another slant on what you're talking about, and that is that mind creates the reality. And so this experience they're talking about, and this questioning, this sort of dialectic between, is this real or is this just some perceptual state? What I wish to suggest is this perceptual state can make this real. There's an interdependent relationship. And you're talking about affective neuroscience, which is an area I do some study in. And the materialists still hold that the mind is an artifact of the brain, but in fact, MRI scans, work done right here by Professor Richard Davidson has demonstrated that there's an interdependent relationship between the brain and the mind. And the mind, certainly right now is recognized as through a force of will. You focus attention, increase awareness, and so you can think of meditation. This actually rewires the brain, especially in this this is a real central region in the brain, and traditionally it's the third eye. So once the mind, and through these practices, rewires the brain then directs or perhaps constrains behavior. So there's this interdependent relationship where you can use your will to direct attention, increase awareness, rewire the brain, and then that rewiring will direct your behavior and what we might often call wisdom. The other thing I wanted to bring up, because everything, and I'm sorry I was late, I was actually working on your dessert for tomorrow. But I recently have had some health challenges, and in those, I had the most chemo that a human body has given. I had a bone marrow transplant, and that completely wipes out all the stem cells in the bone marrow, and if you don't get new ones, you will die very quickly. And when we talk about states and this idea of religious state, I mean, I think the whole concept that we look at religion as something outside of us, rather than think of a continuum of our own psychology leading to our own spirituality. And because of the difference in quantity, we actually have qualitatively different states. So the chemo, and there's been papers written on this, and I think it may be because of all the pain, produced anger states in me. And so here, if we talk about your topic, is mostly on what's considered psychoactive plants and substances like LSD. If we broaden that a little bit and think of even things that are used medicinally, also prednisone, which a lot of people, I've been on that quite a bit, a lot of people will all of a sudden start to clean their house.
Let me answer as much as I can remember about your question. Well, for one thing that psychedelics do is to open this area to experimentation. For example, the two big determinants, or three big determinants in the psychedelic experience are the drug itself, the person's sort of set, that is the psychological setting, including expectations, and the environment. And the will and the desire are part of the set. And this, you could actually have people, teach people to expect different kinds of things and see if this would affect the experience. So you'd get an effect of looking at the cognition and affect of expectation on the experience. By setting different expectations, you could see whether those will work. Also, you can do different doses of a drug. You mentioned several things. Let me just sort of mention one of them now is the immune system. A bit of research that is shouting to be done. We all know that if a person is living a happy, low stress, wholesome life, the immune system will work well, relatively well. Okay, and there's all kinds of information on the immune system working well when the person is happy, humorous, in love, and so forth. And when the person is stressed, the job's going poorly or the relationship's going poorly, the immune system is not working well at all, and the person is more likely to get any number of different diseases. So that's set. Okay. Now, a positive emotional experience boosts the immune system. What about the most positive emotional experience a person can have? And that often happens in a mystical state. So will this influence the immune system in a very positive way? Just because it's like not only being healthy and happy, but it's feeling extremely healthy and extremely happy. So is there a peak in the strength of the immune system following mystical experiences. I think this really is what's crying to be done. Because since we can produce mystical experiences experimentally, here's a possibility of an incredible treatment. Now, at Hopkins, they are now looking at, on the study that's going on now, the dose-response study. They're looking at the effect of the immune system, but looking at it 1 and 2 weeks out. And I want to look at it about 20 minutes to half an hour after the emotional peak. Okay, because it takes the immune system, last I read, was about 20 minutes to half an hour to respond to something like that happening. And is there a huge boost in the immune system that happens as a result of a mystical experience, just as there's a minor boost in the immune system when other less happy things happen? Now, suppose it turns out the mystical experiences are exceedingly good for the immune system. What is this going to do to areas of meditation, psychedelics, yoga, all those things that help produce mystical experiences? They become very important in preventing and treating disease. So I think this is, to me, this is the most important, I'll say the most important bit of research that needs to be done. Now, you're going to have a hard time getting an institutional review board to approve that. You can do it for treatment. Okay. By the way, the place to find out about all these is a website, www.clinicaltrials.gov. It's National Institutes of Health. And they list all the research that's approved and applied for. So you can just go in there and search a particular diagnostic category or a treatment like LSD. Psilocybin and ayahuasca are the ones to look up now. And you get all the studies that have recently been done, are being done, and have been applied to be done. So, but nobody's looking at the immune system, except for this 1 or 2 weeks follow-up. Yeah.
You've mentioned some interesting things about psychedelics, and there is a lot of reactivity to studying them, IRBs and so forth. There's also a category of things called empathogens, like oxytocin. It's not a psychedelic. Can you say anything about your understanding or experiences regarding oxytocin or other empathogens, MDMA or whatever?
I can't say anything about oxytocin. As far as I know, I've never had any.
Well, you're a male, so you're less likely to have had it.
Well, MDMA is technically doesn't qualify as a psychedelic, but everyone considers it one. So it's sort of been adopted into the family, largely because of Rick Doblin's work in MAPS with MDMA, and a study that's recently been completed and is now recruiting subjects for a larger study is the use of MDMA with PTSD, originally it was people largely domestic PTSD. The doctor is a Dr. Mithofer in South Carolina, and he had approval to do 20 patients for usually spousal abuse or rape or domestic violence, but 2 veterans approached him and said they would like to be in the study. And so he got it to approve 2 additional veterans and came out with very positive results. This has been published, Mithofer, and he now is recruiting more veterans who have PTSD, who've been intractable to regular treatment. These are the difficult cases, okay? And that study will be going on probably for the next year or 2. But that's another study that really
was published recently? That was published recently?
Yeah. I've forgotten where. But you can find it under clinical trials or Mithofer, or better yet, MDMA PTSD veterans. And that we got it very quickly. And some veterans group have picked up on this and are trying to promote it. The Army is aware of this. I've been writing to a very important general on this, and there also is a group of advisees working with either Army Medical Corps or VA, I've forgotten which, who are looking at possible treatments, including PTSD treated with MDMA. So that's about where that work is. But MDMA has been used in other sort of studies. It makes people less defensive about facing their own fears and problems, and it works particularly well in relationship sort of things. So yeah, that's another thing. Progress is slow. But for decades, there was no progress at all. You know, the things are really picking up now. So, well, I expect we'll see a lot more on this.
But nothing about oxytocin.
I don't know anything about it. So, I'm reporting my ignorance on this, you know, that's all. So.
Before the printing press, only, you know, monks and certain individuals had access to the text. Then after the printing press, it was widely available. What do you see as I mean, today it seems like all the psychedelics are still pretty much illegal. So what do you see as the change that is going to make it democratized, I guess?
Okay. Well, first of all, there are these small churches that have been starting up. I think the path of adoption will be psychotherapy, and the MDMA PTSD studies is one of these, particularly with veterans. And if the Army gets into it, all of a sudden there'll be, you know, an enormous amount of money and availability there. Some work that's being done with alcoholism. A very interesting bit of research that's also about to be replicated is with people who are dying, terminal patients, and it's to help with their anxiety about death. It doesn't treat the underlying disease, in most cases it's cancer, but it helps them adjust and helps their families adjust to their impending death. And Charlie Grobe at UCLA Medical School has just published a study on this, and he's trying to get more funding in this way. I think the Hopkins people either have funding or they're looking for funding. And the understanding that I have of this is that one of the fears of death is the fear of sort of giving up control and letting go of the self. It's that same fear that's part of social fear, whereas psychedelics can give you a test in that way. So you give up yourself during psychedelics and say, oh, well, this isn't so bad. That's not such a frightening experience. So you get back being yourself, having carried that experience with you. And I think that, I call it the hospice use. I think hospices eventually should get into this. There's a study going on right now at Bellevue Hospital, which is part of NYU Medical School, with terminal patients. Grobe is doing another one, and I think Johns Hopkins is doing another one. So I think the medical way is going to be the door. Now, whether it'll only be medical, I don't know. But I think that's, and then there are these churches that are developing, there are ayahuasca churches developing all over the world. It's sort of amazing.
Well, there's a legal breakthrough where, you know, it's undeniable that if you have a church and you have a sacramental, right, that goes along with it, and that no one will come knocking down your door or whatever, then that would, I think, have an effect, right?
Yeah, and the question, the courts hate to address religious issues because they really think that they should stay off this hot button. But, you know, suppose we say, well, you know, UDV is doing it, and you know, Santa Daime is doing it. Let's have the church of the ayahuasca on the isthmus. And we'll form it right here tonight, okay? Now, is the FDA going to let us get away with that? Or are they saying, you're just doing drugs? See? And that puts them in this terrible position of saying what is and isn't a legitimate religion. And I don't know any good way to resolve that. I mean, if you look at the world's religions, Christianity basically started with 13, and Judaism started with Isaac and Sarah. I mean, you don't need a big number to start a church. What number do you need? And what they're looking at basically is whether these churches fit the model of a church. Do they have regular meetings? Do they have a place of worship? Do they, you know, do all the ritual type stuff? And yet the rituals type stuff is left over from, you know, 500 years ago. There's a question over here.
Yeah, you were talking about before, you wanted to know if there was a way to find the difference between knowing if something was a hallucination produced by your brain, or if you knew if it was real or not, if it was genuine. I'd say just be still, you know, when you experience something, and you know, it's something you have to practice, but I'd say you can definitely determine.
Even be still in the sense of not move around or contemplate what's going on.
Yeah, don't contemplate it. You know, if you're on a drug and you're hallucinating, you might see something on the wall and you might look at it and get interested in it. It might evolve into something more complicated. I'd say that that's definitely something in your brain. You know, it's you interacting with yourself. But if you can be still, then I think, more and more you'll find out what's genuine and what's not.
Well, it certainly works for perceptual stuff. But what do you do with the sense of sacredness?
That too.
Well, one of the questions I'm asking, I'm doing some sort of research in psychology and education, is you can take any topic and plug it into this question. How does blank vary from mind-body state to mind-body state? Or state of consciousness to state of consciousness. I prefer mind-body state. So take whatever you're interested in and plug it in there. And when I would plug in there and say, how does sacredness vary from mind-body state to mind-body state? So which sacredness do I choose, that of my ordinary awake state? And I am a real fan of this state. I think it's evolved for really good reasons, but I don't think it's the only good state. That's where I differ with a lot of people. So I could say, well, okay, I'll wait till I get into my ordinary state, and is this thing sacred? Now I might say, yeah, no, that was just some sort of silly hallucination. Or, oh, I remember, I used to see the sacredness in this, and now I don't, and I've lost it. So that will work. Checking reality will work for things that, for most things, most of the time. But I think there are some things that it doesn't work for. And also, actually, I said, for me, anything that exists is reality. So dreams are real in the sense that they're a subjective experience. They're not real in the sense of everything I've ever dreamt happens to me physically. So, but that kind of question is a question that those are the hard questions. How do you determine which state is good for what purpose? For example, one of the Nobel Prizes occurred to the guy because he learned how to image, and he learned how to image by taking LSD. That was Kerry Mullis's invention of the PCR technique. He's been very clear about that. And he says he probably would not have had that insight without psychedelics. Now, he did not have the insight while he was doing psychedelics, but he learned to image on psychedelics and carry that cognitive ability back to his ordinary state and then have his insight. Now, there's a question of transfer of information between mind-body states. For instance, you wake up in the morning and you know you've had a dream, you can't remember what the dream is, and along about 10:30 something happens, the whole thing downloads and you remember it. Well, that's carrying information from one mind-body state to another. So in cognitive psychology, there's almost no research on cognition. How does cognition vary from mind-body state to mind-body state? That's a big question. It blows the roof off cognitive psychology. Because everything cognitive psychology studies gets studied in every other mind-body state. And there are at least hundreds of other mind-body states. You see what that does to the field? All those questions get re-asked. So any graduate students out there who want to do a high-risk but very worthwhile dissertation on cognitive psychology, ask whatever it is, how does memory vary from mind-body state to mind-body state? You can really only study one or two states at a time. Good luck with the IRBs.
Can you help me, Tom, and anybody you notice who's had their hand up, because it's hard for me to see. So if you would choose, who gets the
Oh,
next
there's one right,
All right.
back here.
So I have a friend who is recovering from cancer. He's almost kicked it, and he's also religious, and he's never had a psychedelic experience. And I explained to him the study that MAPS was doing with terminal cancer patients with MDMA, and I'm sorry, with psilocybin. And I explained to him that this might be worth thinking about, since he's going to live, to think about the experience that him and his wife have just been through. Can you kind of speak to sort of the other side of the problem I'm having is that sometimes psilocybin has a higher body load, and he's gone through a lot of chemo and is kind of frail, and I'm trying to figure out, is LSD a better option for him?
I don't know enough to answer that question about considering his biological state. I wish I did, but I'll just have to pull a no on that one. There was over here.
Which one?
Oh, how about, oh, no, right here, right, woman in the second row.
Okay.
Hi. I was struck by how the mystical state actually challenges the state of being that our whole culture is dependent upon. And so, which is the individualism, competition, and consumption. And so I'm very curious with the legality here because of the churches and sort of what what you're finding in terms of an overlap with some of that? I don't know if it's flying below the radar right now in terms of the corporations and the lobbyists and the political structure that's invested in keeping things as they are. But I wondered if you would speak to that.
Yes, but there's so much to go on that question. I think progress is clearly being made in psychotherapy and medicine. Some, but less in religion. And that's about it. But compared with 5 or 10 years ago, those are enormous openings. Also, the question of societies being open to this, some things like go along and then suddenly there's like a quick switch, like politically as Nixon's going to China. Okay, wham, things change. Other things sort of happen incrementally. In psychedelics right now we're doing incrementally. But what happens if, a senator or senator's wife who's an alcoholic or dying has a treatment with psychedelics and is much better afterwards? How is the senator going to react to that, or other senators? And that could be one of those quick things. But the quick things are pretty unpredictable, I think. But they do happen. And so if they happen, great. The other thing that I think that this is a talk, one of about 5 talks that I have. One is how to raise $1 billion for psychedelic research. And the quick response to that is to found a company whose business is providing psychedelic sessions, and they would be recommended by mental health professionals and so forth. So it would be like the freestanding MRI clinics that are in your hospitals and those freestanding clinics. And this would be a clinic that would provide psychedelic sessions. And it would be staffed by trained medical personnel and meet all those various requirements. Also, there's no reason it has to happen in America first. People say, well, what about? All the whatabouts have to do with these 50 states. Canada, the Scandinavian countries, Holland, Czech Republic, Switzerland are very likely to be open to this. By the way, if you will join MAPS, you'll find MAPS has studies going on in Switzerland and Israel and Jordan. all kinds of places. They're great in doing this, and you can get on their forum or mailing list, and they'll update you on things going on every once in a while. MAPS is Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. And a really good source. It's in my class. Instead of giving them assignments, I call them internet field trips. And one of the internet field trips is to go to the MAPS website, okay, and just explore and see what they can find. Every time I go there, I find stuff that I didn't know about. 2 days ago, I went there and I found they sponsored. There was a conference in San Jose in April, and a lot of the main people in the field talked there. It was called Psychedelic Science in the 21st Century. People could get a CEU unit for medical education and nursing education. So it was accepted sort of in the medical community in California. And all the sessions were videotaped, and now all the videotapes are online. So you can hear, Roland Griffiths talking about the psychedelics work that's been done at Hopkins, and Charlie Grove with dying cancer patients and so forth. So, they're talking heads, basically, with some data slides, but you really get a sense of the field. And there was a sense that things are happening now, that after this long period of being asleep, people are getting together, and now there are things to overcome in terms of laws. But the people doing research now in medicine are doing rather straight medical research. They have an unusual treatment, but it gets approved, and they use the standard measures and all that kind of stuff. And I think this is the door that's going to open. Now, what else is going to come through the door? Religion, probably, at least to some extent. But there again, how do you tell what's a legitimate church? By the way, if you really want to have fun with these questions, the question to ask is, who knows enough, is wise enough, and informed enough to answer these questions? As far as I know, the answer is no one. Okay. These are big social questions. Who? Yeah, I don't consider most of them very well informed on psychedelics. A few of them may be. And how, it's not what are the answers to these questions, but how do we structure the decision that yes or no on any particular use or any particular drug. And is this a political decision? Is it a medical decision? Is it a psychological decision? Is it an economic decision? Is it a religious decision? Is it a social decision? And the answer is yes, all of the above. And we don't have a structure to consider all of the above. So we're doing these little bits, like a little bit of religion, a little bit of, but it is a political issue, but it's more than a political issue. And one of the things that psychedelics do is to challenge the decision-making structure that we have. And who can make a religious decision? A clergyman? Well, most clergy are not going to be open to psychedelics, although a few may be. And who determines which ones, who's a legitimate clergy, and the government doesn't want to get into that. You know, you can go down to the county hall and register yourself as a clergy and do marriages. You don't have to, you can just make up any church you want. And at least in Illinois, and I assume Wisconsin is that way. And they're not going to say no. So can people self-appoint themselves head of a church? Well, there's some people I would not want to do that.
I'd like to weigh in on what you just said too, and just ask what is the big fear or problem or obstacle? Because I just read an article and reread it, latest Vanity Fair. Over 200,000 Americans die every year from so-called safe, legally prescribed pharmaceuticals. Over 200,000 deaths. And with the full force of Madison Avenue promoting, pushing these pharmaceuticals that result in over 200,000 deaths. So it's bizarre and surreal when you look at it. You know, what is, in all of your experience, what is it trigger in people? Is there just a great deal of fear of psychedelics, and is that part of the problem?
In my experience, when you find a lot of people doing something or feeling something or thinking something, there are probably a lot of different reasons. And most people are combinations of reasons rather than one. So I think some of the ingredients are fear of letting go of leaving self-control. Okay, and we're told we should be in charge, you know, so if I give my mind over to a drug, am I losing self-control? Might I commit something that's detrimental to myself, to my others, or to a building, or to somebody? There's the religious challenge, is that, you know, this is, that God doesn't come to express himself or herself in your mind, but the devil does. Okay, and this is one of the arguments against meditation, for example. You know, you drop your defenses and the devil will grab your brain, so to speak. There's all the social stigma. Like when I talk around a university, there are usually 2 or 3 people who come, I was going to say young people, but they're not young anymore, who will come up to me afterwards and say, I wish I could teach a course like this at my university, but, okay. And they have to be realistic. If they're going to apply for a job somewhere else and they're teaching psychedelic something or other, is this going to knock them down on the candidate list? And that's a realistic fear, although I think most people are over-fearful for the amount of reality that's out there, particularly now. Oh, 2 really good, if you want to justify yourself. The Lancet had a wonderful article called Psychedelic Drugs Return to the Mainstream. I think it was 2006 or 2008. And then the current issue of Scientific American has another article about psychedelics being used for PTSD and death anxiety. Okay, and so those are 2, you know, well-established. It's not, you know, hippy-dippy journal, something or other. So if those are really, you can ground an argument in a lot of good professional, like the Journal of Psychopharmacology and the Journal Pharmacology. Those are different journals. I want to start a series of journals called, you know, there's Pharmacology, Journal of Pharmacology, another Journal of Pharmacology, yet another Journal of Psychopharmacology. But I don't think there's a question.
Yeah, just a quick one. Okay. This has been really a great talk, so thanks very much for coming out here. Someone had asked a question earlier about whether there were clinical trials available or the possibility of entering somebody into a psilocybin trial. And Roland Griffiths is enrolling patients and people particularly on the terminal side, but also depression. So if you go to the Hopkins website, and specifically under Roland Griffiths, then you can find a phone number to call, and he's got great people to talk to. Two other very quick questions, and if you want to comment on these at all. Any comments you might want to make on ibogaine, and/or salvia divinorum?
I've never had either. So what I know is just sort of what I picked up, from reading. Salvia, the readings on salvia have puzzled me a great deal. I get everything from, I chewed a lot or tried smoking it or swallowing it and nothing happened, to I took a couple of leaves and, fell over and peed on the ground. Not actually that, but that kind of, result. So I'm not sure what to think about salvia. And ibogaine, I think, will finally, is increasingly being accepted. The guy, Howard Lotsoff, who started promoting it, seemed to be promoting it as a way to make money for his own business. And that sort of made a lot of people wary of it. He was a former heroin addict who took ibogaine and stopped his desire for heroin. But other people have been picking up on it, and there have been some studies on this, sort of anecdotal, some treatment clinical studies, but some really good work ought to be done on that. Ibogaine is a root that comes from Western Africa. And that's as much as I can tell. But clearly this is another lead. There's so many leads in this direction to follow. Yeah.
I've been invited, and until this moment, have not really taken the invite seriously, but I've been invited to plan a trip by my cousin Roxanne Kramer, whose efforts were largely responsible for saving the pink river dolphins of the Amazon River. You can Google Roxanne Kramer's name, but she has 349 acres in Iquitos that she owns. She wants to sell, but she wants me to bring people down to do ayahuasca ceremonies with her 2 shamans that she is intimately in touch with on a regular basis. She's had 3 heart attacks, so she wants to sell the land and the 3-story bed and breakfast in Iquitos, who one of the residents of this bed and breakfast is a shaman. And I'm now seriously thinking about next January, a year from this month, next month, to do that. It just occurred to me to make that announcement now. Anyone interested? If there is enough interest, we will do it. Thank you. My name is Ken Adi Ring.
I've done ayahuasca 4 times, a low to moderate dose. I was co-leading a workshop in Brazil, not last summer, but the summer before, and not in the Amazon. We had out, and my my main experience is I know what the word putrid means. It really tastes awful. And I wish now I'd had a larger dose, but I didn't want to challenge my GI tract right at that particular time. So. But a lot of people have had, apparently, again, very different kinds of experiences. And I don't know enough to recommend who is or who isn't a good shaman.
Hi, I know there's been some speculation recently or questions why our mind has receptors for these different chemicals. And I've been thinking about it recently, reading some books, Spirit Molecule and some other books. And I've been thinking that maybe it's the chemicals using us to achieve consciousness themselves. Just a thought.
I'm not willing to grant consciousness intentionality, chemicals intentionality.
Okay.
If you are, okay. But certainly psychoactive plants and humans have grown up, and humans have spread psychoactive plants. But I don't think marijuana says I want to spread. I have no way of finding out if it did. But.
I believe you said that you would not recommend this experience for everybody, and I wonder if you could say some more about who you would see as being particularly good candidates versus being not good candidates.
Okay. The best place to get information on this is to go to the www.clinicalscience.org clinicalstudies.com, and they will give the criteria for becoming a volunteer and for not being a volunteer. Now, that said, a lot depends on the intent of the session. People who are pre-psychotic or have psychosis in the family may very well become psychotic. With a very well-trained psychotherapist, they may be able to work through that, but this would not apply to the work that's being done in universities today or to taking psychedelics on one's own. Another reason is that reason for being screened out is problems with the circulatory system, in which now the problem is not that the drug causes a problem, but that it also often increases emotional stress, which in turn increases blood pressure and heart rate. So it's a secondary effect of the emotions that can be affected. Stan Groff has asked this and gives a very interesting, I think, very psychiatric, insightful story. He says because there was, remember 30 years ago, there was the idea that psychedelics cause birth defects. And this received a lot of attention in the press and in the newspapers and so on. And in the county fair that I go to, there was a anti-drug exhibit, and they showed thalidomide babies and said, drugs do this to your baby. So okay, so and that's still to some extent being taught in classes now. So now, even though it's been shown that that does not happen, okay, people looking at the research say no, that doesn't happen. Now, what Groff says is this insight, nice psychiatric insight, is that a woman who is pregnant or may soon become pregnant should not do psychedelics, not because they might harm her and the fetus, but women with excellent prenatal care can still have babies that are born with deformities or problems in one way or the other. And even though they know rationally, the LSD did not do this, the woman does not need to go through every day of the rest of her life thinking, what if I hadn't done it? Now that is a nice insight about how the human mind works, irrationally. And that's true, People don't, a woman doesn't need that worry. Now this is a very small number of cases. There are a lot of babies that are born with parents who were tripping when they were conceived or, within the 9-month period. But that understands, that's a nice bit of understanding in this. So basically it's fragile psychological structure and the person's, now, if the person is undergoing psychotherapy with a trained psychotherapist who can handle these situations, that might be all right, okay, but not for most other purposes. And then immune or circulatory system and not pregnant women.
All right, so my question has to do with just share your insight on Terence McKenna's work, and maybe he had this feeling that when he was taking DMT that he was going to the same place every time, and that after a while he didn't think he was really hallucinating, that he was actually visiting the same place and having interactions with the same creatures who were in that world.
The experience of, I'm back home again, this is where I belong, this is my true space, often comes up, not in every session, but often, and when I get back there in my own session, I think, I know this space, I've been here before. To me, Terence McKenna takes a little bit of data and over-speculates and fictionalizes it. And I really anger all the McKenna fans when I hear this. But I think he's extremely entertaining to listen to. He's a great storyteller, with that funny voice especially. But he overdoes. I'm tempted to say he does too much damage because of it, but I don't think it's quite fair for me to say that. So that's my degree of unsureness on this thing. But I really think he just takes. To me, he's more of a performer than an explorer, and that's somewhat unfair. But that's the way I see him. I forgot. There's one book. I think it's Lexter's book called Shrooms that does a very powerful criticism of McKenna, and I thought he pulled that off really nicely. On the other hand, he's, lots of fun. So Timothy Leary was a lot of fun, too. Yeah.
Groff went from doing LSD experiments to do breathwork experience because of the legal problems. Has he talked about the difference in those process? It replicates some of the psychedelic experiences, but I imagine there are others that can't be created with breathwork, and I wondered, has he written about that difference, or do you know what's
As
missing?
far as I know, his writings on that basically say that you can come across the same experiences, both methods, but with breath work, it's sort of like wading into the water, and with LSD, it's like diving off a 3-meter board. And, but I haven't read everything he's written, but as far as I know, that's it. Do you know if something has he written? Do you know of anything on that?
I don't.
I'd like to know
I'm
that.
curious.
Yeah.
So you've had all these experiences yourself, right?
Psychedelic experiences?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I've had all of them, but I've had a lot
Oh,
of them.
yeah. I was just a personal question is how do you deal with when you have something that feels like the word paradoxically normal? How do you deal with the frustration of trying to explain it to people who don't know what you're talking about?
Oh. Yeah, one of the things I tell my class is that trying to tell somebody about a psychedelic experience is like trying to tell somebody who's, or let's say most people didn't dream, and you dreamt, you try to tell people what a dream was.
I feel like
There's no way of doing it really.
I feel like I'm gonna say something really true to myself, and then when it comes out, it sounds like a bunch of cliches that I've heard before in like 15th century poetry or something. But it's really interesting.
That may be as good as we can do on it.
Yeah, I mean it's really frustrating. I wanted to, really almost hit somebody. I think, just to see something like that that's so obvious and so simple, and then not be able to explain it. It's cruel.
Well, that's the ineffability. Well, now the question here is it inexplainable because not enough people have done it, the experience, and you can't explain it to them? Like if people didn't dream, you couldn't explain what dreams were like. Or if you ran across people who couldn't taste salt, how would you explain the taste of salt? Is it a weakness in experience? Is it a weakness in our vocabulary? What kind of or combination of problems is this? Certainly it's vocabulary. I mean, if someone's never tasted salt, then we could discuss saltiness with that person.
Yeah.
So if someone had never tripped, could we discuss a psychedelic experience? Well, only in a poetic sense, like it's like dreams.
Well,
it isn't like dreams.
I mean, like specifically, I mean when it just comes to like social things, like if you become, if you get if you become skeptical, if what? Okay, if you realize that you just kind of wake up for a second, you're like, this is how it is, and I remember that this makes sense, and you take it back with you, and it's bizarre.
I guess you just have to have a lot of tolerance for bizarreness.
I guess it's about it, yeah.
Is that it? Oh, one more.
I appreciate the talk you've been doing here. Life is an experiential thing, and it has to do with a belief system. And people are predisposed by vibration, whether it's sound or it's words or it's feelings or it's however our senses can perceive. And because of that, we prejudge and filter according to our belief system. And then that limits how we can expand our belief system or how we can expand our awareness. And the question I'm trying to lead up to is, at what point do we utilize chemicals to suspend our beliefs so that we can become aware of a greaterness to our awakening Or do we do this by deprivation, or do we do it by other challenges, like people can hallucinate? Myself, I've done it from deprivation, where you can fast, and you're basically experiencing another reality outside of what is considered the norm by what people subscribe to and believe in. At what point do you use your, I know the chemicals are being used as an invitation or an advertisement for a higher or a larger awareness. So many things in our life right now are controlled by chemicals. We have restless leg syndrome. We have whatever aches and pains, or mood enhancers. You know, I don't feel good, I got a headache, or I feel depressed, or take a drug. You know, the medical society and the drug society want to control that belief system of what works and what doesn't. And so by you introducing something that can maybe augment or replace or supplement that system is a challenge to that system. What do you feel on that?
The way that new inventions are adopted is often to do what's already being done, only better. The motion picture camera is a good example of that. Originally, it was set up in the 12th row center to film plays, and then we've developed the film industry out of it. So I think with psychedelics, that model is good. Is the first way to use them is to do things we already want to do, like treat PTSD and fear of death, and so those things. So they and at that point they become less frightening and more adaptable. And then going on from there, we discover we can do other things. So the computer is a beautiful example of this, from being basically an adding machine, to all the stuff that's going on now. And but basically, what it allowed us to do was originally do adding, and it was used in the census originally. That's IBM cards. What we call IBM cards now are holes on the census data. And now look what we're doing with it. So I think the thing to do is to use it in, and we will. I mean, we have things we want to do. We use our resources to do those things, like word processing or sending email and communicating. So I think that model will go along with psychedelics, and the generation that grows up with psychedelics probably will be like the generation that grows up with computers. Like if I have a problem with computers, I ask my students, who are about a third my age, okay, and they know right away, okay, because it's natural, it's part of their culture. And I think the same thing eventually will happen with psychedelics. Now there is the group of people who, as they say, I was a student in the 60s. I know whenever I hear a conversation starting that way where it's going to go. Like when my office before I retired was full of rock posters in the 60s. And these people would show up who looked like instructors and graduate assistants, and they walk by and say, oh, I like your posters. So I know where that conversation's going. So I say, oh yeah, well I teach a course in psychedelics, and they'll sort of look at me. In about 3 sentences we'll get into psychedelic experiences. So that generation now actually are in their 50s and 60s, as well as like a sort of bumper generation coming along after them. And I think it's a matter of the big question, I think, here is how do we get society to look at psychedelics seriously? And I think there are two big answers to that. One is we need more money, and one is we need more people. And one of the ways to get more people is to encourage, universities to teach more classes in psychedelics. When I taught my course 30 years ago, I thought, okay, I'll get it established. I've broken the ice. Now people at other colleges and universities will be able to do it. Because Northern Illinois University is not noted as a very liberal, creative, intellectual place. And if we can do it in an ordinary state school, you ought to be able to do it wherever. And it hasn't happened, except now there's one course in a community college near Chicago. There's another one starting at Institute for Transpersonal Psychology. And I think the ground is getting more receptive. And those articles, like in the Lancet and Scientific American, give good, solid backing. So one of the things I hope will happen is that some people will start teaching these courses, or units in other courses. If you're teaching a course in anthropology or biology or religion or anything else except maybe math and engineering, I'm stuck on those two, except chemical engineering, you can insert a unit on psychedelics. Okay, and that makes them less frightening. The other thing is, I think we need to recruit foundations and funding agencies to take on psychedelic funding. And I think I think we're going that way. Now, it's not as frightening as it used to be. You know, and if we could get, you know, like Howard Hughes Medical Institute and Robert Woods Johnson Foundation to start funding psychedelic research, or even the replications like Mitteroff's research with PTSD with veterans. I mean, this is a heart-rending situation, and a political political situation. And if those can be passed, then we start, you know, working it into society.
Yes, I think I can speak up. Thank you. Dr. Roberts, why is marijuana not classified as an entheogen?
For something to be, let me start with psychedelic. By the way, there's a discussion whether to use the word psychedelic or entheogen. I prefer to reserve the use of entheogen for religious, spiritual purposes, and psychedelic is the more general term, so I can talk about the entheogenic use of psychedelics. Okay. Now, to make something a psychedelic, there are 3 or 4 different definitions. One that I like is that magnifies or amplifies whatever processes are already going on in your mind. This raises interesting questions about when you take a strong dose of psychedelic and have a weird experience, are those things going on in your mind and you're just becoming aware of it, or does the psychedelic produce that experience? But at any rate, LSD clearly is actually, Stan Grof calls it an amplifier. I'm visually oriented. I call it a psychomagnifier. It magnifies whatever's going on in your mind, but that includes down to the unconscious that we're normally not aware of. So that psychedelic is like a very powerful microscope. Marijuana is more like one of those little magnifying glasses, and it magnifies things a little bit. And it either barely qualifies as a psychedelic or doesn't quite qualify as a psychedelic. And this is one of those definitional areas that I think is going to go back and forth. So I don't consider it a psychedelic. It really is its own area in terms of medical uses and cultural use, although there's a lot of overlap with psychedelics. So, but that's
Well, I saw it defined as a psychoactive plant, entheogenous psychoactive plant.
No, I would say the large category is psychoactive substances, and they're chemicals in plants. Okay, and like caffeine is psychoactive, sugar is psychoactive, chocolate is psychoactive. Okay, and but they're part of our culture. Alcohol, of course, is. So those are all psychoactive. So psychoactive is the broad category, and then within that, you know, there are opiates and there are barbiturates and there are speeds and psychedelics is one of that category. And the psychedelics fall off into chemical psychedelics and plant psychedelics, which overlap, of course.
So then for you, the entheogen would be more psychedelic, would be a part of that definition.
Yeah, I would say it's a psychedelic used in a spiritual context, or not intended to use in a spiritual context, but resulting in a spiritual experience. For example, myself, I was using psychedelics for just exploration and something I had, but would qualify as a mystical experience, including a sense of sacredness. Now, I didn't do that with an intent, but I would say that particular use of LSD for me was an entheogenic use, although I didn't intend it. See, so that's the way I use that.
Thank you.
And as I walk over here, Terence McKenna talks about that the problem that most people don't think marijuana is a psychedelic is they don't do enough, and they do it too often and get desensitized. He believed that, you know, if somebody just did it every so often and did too much, for example, that would be a psychedelic experience. Where is the...
When you talk about amplification, just as an observation, it seems like from my experience, it seems like you shouldn't do psilocybin mushrooms like the same week your girlfriend breaks up with you. That's just my own from the past. But anyway, that's just a comment.
Well, that's definitely true.
Yeah, that was hard. But they, I went to NIU in '79, and you were our faculty advisor for the Student Transpersonal Club. So I thank you for being there. At the time, you were into a LSD for past life therapy. Told a story about some woman that was afraid of birds and stuff. So, but anyway, just a simple question: was it if all these hippies were doing all the psychedelic drugs, has any study been done that said the hippie culture is more spiritually advanced?
Good question.
Some individuals in it were, but not, I wouldn't say the whole culture was. But I don't know of any really good hard data on that.
Yeah.
That's as much as I can give you on.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you have any thoughts about this research, if it goes further and builds, and how that might affect the psychiatric category of schizophrenia, being that there's a lot of similarities between schizophrenia and psychedelic experience.
As much as I can tell you on that is that some schizophrenics seem to respond well to psychedelics, but I don't even know what percentage that is. So I can't give you a good answer on that one.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.